So welcome to our lecture on music and classification. And I kind of got the idea for this lecture after thinking about our previous talk on music and creativity and the idea of musical formula kind of being even used in new and interesting ways. And so like we talked about the descending fifths pattern of that's used, in many different types of genres of music, and then how that formula, even within a formula, you can still be creative. And it got me thinking about how we think about music. So formula is a type of a way of classifying certain music, and then I thought we should talk about how we classify music across the world. And I could have done a very kind of broad lecture and given you different ways of classification schemes, different ways of transcribing, et cetera, et cetera. But I thought it was be more interesting for us to kind of dive into one and maybe the most controversial way of music classification that's happened in the 20th century, and that's talking about the idea of Cantometrics and kind of studying the entire world's musical output in one classification system, and some of the pitfalls, some of the challenges this may present, and some of the maybe the interesting opportunities that thinking about the entire world's music brings about. So we'll have a fun lecture today. I think we'll also have some interesting small kind of activity where we do a small kind of sample of what maybe coding for a Cantometric style analysis or classification was like, even though I'm stripping it way down to a very short classification. But yeah, it should be fun. And we'll talk about Cantometrics and Alan Lomax and his contributions to musicology and ethnomusicology. So the first thing to understand really is what we're talking about when I say Cantometrics, and basically canto meaning song and metrics meaning measurement. So is there some relatively objective way of measuring the attributes of songs and then graphing those attributes out so you can find similarities between different genres, different cultures, different world musics that are not necessarily related or closely related at all. And so Alan Lomax came up with this idea of Cantometrics and pushed it for a while, and again, kind of as you read in your article, received some kind of pushback from a lot of musicologists and ethnomusicologists out there for reasons we'll talk about in a little bit. But just to kind of understand the general idea about Cantometrics is it's stripping away some of the non-musical features that are always present in performance, and really looking at the musical or the sonic output. So you're looking at acoustic features, vocal and instrumental features, and then really looking down to the kind of very core of the song performance, and you're kind of mapping that out in terms of attributes. It's a way of classifying music, of finding connections again, and also relating this music to culture and society, and maybe trying to understand the way society produces certain types of music and ways certain types of music may reinforce certain social, cultural institutions or traits, etc. Should give a little bit of background about Alan Lomax. You read about him in the article for today, but I think he's a really interesting figure, a fascinating guy who just had an enormous impact and just generally on the field of musicology and ethnomusicology. He was born in 1915 and only recently passed away in 2002. He was a musicologist, writer, producer, musician. He began his work mostly in the American South, but also the Southwest, Midwest, and other places across the world with his father, John Lomax, who was a very famous folklorist. And Alan continued this work with folk musicians, and by folk music, I'm not meaning just the kind of very limited category of folk music, but just kind of the music of the people, the traditional songs of the people in America and across the world. But Alan worked with Woody Guthrie, with Leadbelly, with a lot of different famous artists out there, and I think his work with Leadbelly really, as you mentioned in your article, it pushed him to think about music and its relationship to society and culture, and then gave him the later idea for Cantometrics. So here's a few pictures from his work. I mean, you can imagine he really drove around the South and the whole United States with this old car with this huge, recording equipment. Just kind of looks very antiquated and antique nowadays with our sleek digital recorders. But this is what he did. He'd drive around, recording and interviewing musicians all around the country. He worked with musicians in prison. He worked with musicians way out in the deep South and these very rural and hard to get to areas, recording them and listening to their music and writing down their stories. And like I said, his associations with Leadbelly and other really famous musicians really pushed him to make this formulate this idea about music and its relationship to society and society's relationship with music. And so, like I said, Lomax really in the 1950s really started to think about constructing a way of understanding music, a cross-cultural, multidisciplinary way of understanding music and its relationship to social structure. And he came up with this idea about Cantometrics, that by understanding music, we could see music as a marker of human history. We could see the kind of migration of people, the exchange of ideas and cultural ideas through music. So the two themes of Cantometrics would be really music as a marker of human history and music as a functional reinforcer of social structure. And by social structure, I mean, social institutions, groups, all these things combined, and music as a marker of history, like I said, as an example of or kind of tracing the migrations of people, of the movement of people and the ideas and culture. This really, the idea of music as a marker of human history really goes back to an approach an anthropological approach about kind of this idea of diffusion of ideas, of technology, etc., and also of evolution. So there's kind of a diffusionist / evolutionist approach in anthropology that Lomax was relying on, and this has a long history in kind of early anthropology, as we're looking at kind of the use, especially with like the use of tools in kind of prehistoric society or peoples, the spreading and use of different tools as a way of understanding the different migrations of humans. And I think Lomax saw this as an idea, a way of using music to understand the same sort of thing. Music as a way of understanding how ideas and styles of music and ways of producing sound and styles of producing music are shared and also move as people move across the globe, and also as cultures interact, they also share their music as well. His other concern was a structural functionalist approach to understanding how music reinforces aspects of the social structure. And so basically the structural functionalist approach is saying that social structures are patterns that are evolved to meet human needs, and these institutions or humans kind of create these institutions, and by institutions I mean broadly institution type things like religion or types of cultural practices, and these institutions help maintain society and they help maintain stability and order within society. So both the diffusionist evolutionist idea and the structural functionalist idea are tied up in Lomax's themes for Cantometrics. Again, the study of human history, music as a marker of human history, and also the study of how music reinforces social structure, how it reinforces social norms and practices. And Alan Lomax really looked at the idea of, you read in your article, he had this enormous database of music, of traditional music, and he tried to relate this to different cultural groups across the world. He didn't include, kind of high art classical music or popular music, etc., because he found that those were not as, or he felt that these were not as indicative of traditional cultural practices, like folk song would be, or like the songs of maybe more isolated groups. And in sampling the kind of these types of traditional songs from across the world, Lomax came up with basically 10 song style regions, and you could see a little map here on your screen, looking from African gather in the kind of, East and South Africa, up to the kind of the circum-Pacific groups, which are basically, related to the Siberian groups, that also there's kind of native groups that moved down through the US and into South America. There's the kind of Malayo-Polynesian and Circum-Pacific groups that also traded information, and old high cultures that are kind of related to the Silk Road cultures of China and India and Southeast Asia and the Islamic world over into North Africa, etc. And so he found these general song style regions had similar characteristics in many of their traditional songs. And what he tried to do was sample a certain number of songs per culture, and then helps group these songs into these song style regions. And again, like what he was looking at was how music can trace not only human migration but also cultural practices that are passed between cultures or shared between neighboring groups. And so what he's looking at is kind of the diffusion of song styles through migration, the diffusion of song styles through cultural contact, and that gives him a really interesting way to map out human history through music rather than the kind of typical anthropological approach of mapping out human history, especially prehistory, through like the use of tools, etc. And so, like I mentioned, he came up with these 10 regional song types, and you have them listed on your screen: African Gather, Proto-Melanesia, Siberian, Circum-Pacific, Nuclear America, Tropical Gardeners, Malayo-Polynesian, Central Asia, Old High Culture, and then Western Europe. And he looked at representative examples from all these different cultures and try to get at least 10 songs from certain these cultures to kind of give a representative sample. And he looked at in classifying the songs, looked at 9 different musical style factors: the text of a song, the instrumentation, dynamics, vocal texture, vocal blend, ornamentation, vocal tension, rhythm, and form. And I think these are all important for you to know about. I won't give you a quiz on each what are the 9 factors that Lomax looked at. But within these 9 factors, he had again even smaller differences. And so within the idea of text, he had the number of vocables per during the song, or the interval size. So that was each category has further delineations of type of musical style. And he tried to relate these musical styles and the song style factors to different types of social structures. So the productivity of a society, their type of diet, their division of labor, their sexual mores, and if they were like sexually liberal or very restrictive. And by relating these things, Lomax's idea was that you could not only show the migration of but also humans and the kind of exchange of ideas between cultures. You could map these things out and find similarities that would not necessarily be obvious to the eye if you look at only song style, or if you look at only social structure. But by mapping both music and social structure together, you could find similarities, find paths of exchange and migration, and maybe show some similarities between societies. And so here you have a more detailed look of this. And so you have the song style factors right in the middle of your screen, and the kind of the cantometric characters on the far left. And then what would happen is, this is basically what the kind of the left hand side of your screen is the kind of coding type of the coding that people would do. They would listen to a piece of music, and then in each category they would mark off the number of vocables, the interval size, the type of enunciation, whether it's precise or slurred, etc., going down this list and giving groupings to each song example. And then that would also then be related to later on through a different analysis to the type of social structure where the song came from. And so I think, given this kind of, it's not a very complex system. It's time consuming. It's a lot of different factors to consider when listening to a song, but I thought just for fun, we should do a little bit of the Cantometric style analysis for ourselves. And so what I've done is put up 2 different surveys for 2 different examples on Canvas, the Canvas website. And so what I want you to do is pause this lecture, go to underneath where the lecture is listed, and find the appropriate example and survey. There will be 2 of them. So again, two examples and 2 surveys, 1 for each. And what I want you to do is listen to the example number 1 first. Just listen through, take some notes about maybe what you're hearing or what maybe the musical features. Think about like the intervals, think about the instrumentation, think about the volume, all these factors, and then listen to it again while you're going through the survey and answering the 9. You're going to be scoring the kind of different factors. I've selected a very few out of the kind of 36 factors that were on the previous slide. I've selected out 9 where you'll score them all together. And then listen through while you're scoring, and then again listen through the example again a 3rd time and go through again and look back on your survey answers to make sure that's what you actually you confirm what you've done. Each example is only about 30 seconds long, so this shouldn't take you all that much time. And what I think will be interesting is once that's all done, I will do again another analysis of this survey, and I'll post it up as a kind of a graph, and we'll see the classes coding of these 2 different songs, and see if there's something we can glean from how you operated. Again, this is again not the full Cantometrics process or coding process, but it'll give you a taste of what these oftentimes there were students doing the coding would go through when they listened to these many thousands of songs that Lomax coded for his Cantometrics project. And I will post this, the analysis of the survey, hopefully over the weekend, along with the analysis of the previous lectures surveys on music and creativity, and I think it'll be hopefully we'll get some interesting results out of that. So again, pause the lecture, do the 2 surveys with the 2 examples, and then come back to the lecture and I'll talk about the examples that we heard and maybe some of the features and how that might relate to, the musical features might be related to the social structure of the examples. Before we go into the examples, I thought I should give you a little, maybe a taste of what Lomax was trying to do. So I have a hard time finding videos on Cantometrics, but Lomax also did some work, not quite as detailed work with Cantometrics, but he did some work on dance and human history. So he called it choreometrics, basically studying the movements of people. And there's a nice little video here linked below if you want to watch that. I would say watch, it's a 20 some odd minute long video, but if you want to watch at least the 10 minutes or so. And it'll give you a good idea of the way he's trying to classify different movement types and then relate that to the social structure, the tool type, the other kind of social cultural aspects, and he's relating that to the dance movements of these different cultures. Like Cantometrics, choreometrics was a little bit criticized, but I think in a few instances he's actually Lomax was able to really gather some interesting data, especially about the migration of kind of Siberian across into Alaska and then down as the native peoples moved down the kind of west coast of the Americas. Lomax's choreometric analysis of some of the dances of some of these people really did show an interesting migration path for these people and a similarity in style that you can trace from Siberia in Russia and then all the way down the western coast of the Americas. And so there has been some useful analysis or results coming out of this idea of choreometrics. But again, this is just an example of what Lomax is looking at. So pause the lecture here, watch a little bit of the choreometrics video, and then come back and we can talk about the survey examples that you just coded. So the first example is a 30-second little clip from the Juhosani Bushmen, and these are a native group who live in Namibia, and they're a native kind of nomadic group that now is really kind of restricted to a certain region. They've been restricted because of cattle grazing, because of kind of the changes to their environment. But I think it's a really interesting piece of music where you have this kind of hocketed melody, many people making this melody. I think I'm actually not going to guess how you coded it. I'll give you an analysis of your coding again over the weekend in terms of the rhythm, the vocables, the interlocking melodies, etc. But I think this is a really interesting group of people who whose music and kind of way of life are under threat from the kind of incursion of modernity in their environment. Some of the interesting social features from this group of people are that they're not, it is not a very hierarchical group kind of classification of their leaders, and so they may have some leaders or people who are in more positions of authority, but for the most part, it's actually they're not really quite as dependent. They're not like very hierarchical in their leadership style. It's a very almost communal style leadership, and mostly based on the age. Whoever is older generally has a little bit more say in how things are run in their society. In terms of gender roles, the women generally are doing the planting of food and collecting of water, which accounts for most of the group's sustenance, while men do some hunting. But these gender roles are not very strict, and people do men and women do both of these kind of tasks without any with little or no shame, and so it's not a very gender restricted society. Women are often taking care of children, but taking care of children doesn't mean they're stuck at home or in the little village. They're out, gathering food, planting food, gathering water, etc. And so there's a lot of socialization between men and women that are in it. So it's much kind of more, in a sense, a little bit more egalitarian than some other societies out there. Like I said, a lot of their territory, they used to be very nomadic, and they would move their villages basically eight or nine times a year. Again, we're talking about Namibia, which is in the kind of southern western side of Africa. But because of the cattle ranching that's going on there now, the cows are kind of the ranchers have kind of have these incursions on their land, and since the cows are eating the kind of sparse vegetation out in their area, these Hosani Bushmen are not able to migrate as much as they used to, because there really aren't any, the game that they used to hunt is not there anymore. As their nomadic lifestyle is being more and more restricted by the governments in Namibia and Botswana, and they're also settling down more. They're being kind of settled into houses. Their gender roles are also changing, and so there's more, especially nowadays, there's more, the females are more restricted to the home. It's a less of an egalitarian society now that there's this kind of restriction on their movements. And so we'll see how you guys coded it. We'll see how, if we can draw any conclusions from that, from your coding of their music. But I think it's interesting to think about their musical style and how it might be related to their social structure and how that's changing, especially because of the incursion of cattle ranching and the governments in Namibia and Botswana, how that's changing and how that might change their music. That's kind of for us to see in the future. The second survey example that you listened to was a really nice example from Mongolia. It's a Mongolian long song, or Ertendu, and this is sung by this woman here on the top part of your screen. She's a very famous singer in the Mongolian style, and it was also accompanied by this horse-haired fiddle called the Morinhur, which is this, again, on the right-hand side of your screen. It's a two-stringed fiddle that is oftentimes accompanying these Mongolian long songs. And the song was really meant to evoke, the song is titled The River Herlin, and it's meant to evoke this kind of, the scenery and the style of Mongolian life and living out there. the text of the song is actually kind of a narrative about a younger brother lamenting his older sibling's disappearance, and he's lonely out there in the wide open spaces that are surrounding the kind of river Herlin. And it's kind of this beautiful and sad song about loneliness in this very lonely and expansive country. Again, that this Mongolian kind of herder and ranching type culture has that it comes from. It's called a long song, not because it's long in length, but because of the vowels that the singer is singing. They're stretched out, these long kind of stretched out vowels is kind of the style of singing. And again, what it's really doing is it's a very traditional song, but it meant again to evoke the kind of space and place of the Mongolian nomadic living tradition that's been going on for many hundreds, if not thousands of years. In terms of social structure, again, it'll be interesting how you guys coded this example, and I'll try and find also if there were any, if this song was actually coded by Lomax's team in terms of the Cantometrics projects, and we'll compare your coding with their coding. But in terms of social structure, the Mongolian life is really a heavily patriarchal society, unlike the Bushmen of Namibia and Botswana. Families live in these yurts, these kind of movable tents, these migratory places where they raise horses and sometimes, cattle, goats, etc. And they live either in nuclear families or extended families. Are both pretty common. In terms of gender roles, typically the men are out taking care of the horses or the livestock, and women are generally more restricted to the kind of home environment where they're collecting water, they're milking the animals, they're making butter, they're making, making different food products, they're raising the children, and they're, erecting the tents and the gers or the yurts, it's more of a settled lifestyle for these women, and the chores are less shared. They're not quite as equally shared as in the previous example with the Bushmen. It's more of a gendered differences in the society. That said, wives do have the right to inherit property from once the husband passes on. So it's not an extreme patriarchal society as we can find other places in the world. Again, these examples are interesting, and it might be, I think it's fascinating to think that musical style, not only for this Mongolian long song, is evoking kind of a place, but it also might be contributing to the reinforcing of certain social structures or social patterns or institutions. There's a great, just offhand, there's a great movie about these Mongolian eagle hunters, and there's a girl eagle hunter who wants to be part of the eagle hunting tradition, which has traditionally been male, for thousands of years. And so I'd encourage you to look that up. The name is actually escaping me right now, but it's a really beautifully shot movie and really interesting depiction of the kind of the role of gender in traditional Mongolian society. So having done that exercise, I hope it was maybe a little interesting, and maybe you can get some of the ideas of how maybe challenging it might be to characterize or give, code different songs from across the world, especially if you're unfamiliar with their practice. I think after some practice of actually coding it, it becomes easier. But I have to mention some of the critiques that Cantometrics, the system, really people brought up some certain criticisms about the system that are still valid today, and I think we should point out. And I also bring this up because many of you have wanted to do comparative projects for your research projects for this class, and so this is one of the things when I said, it's a little difficult to do comparative work, and there are a lot of pitfalls, and maybe some of these critiques of Cantometrics are emblematic of some of the pitfalls of doing comparative musicological work. But some of the critiques of Cantometrics were that the sampling that Lomax was using was not actually really representative, that there are the songs were chosen were not representative of the entire culture as a whole, or we could easily find songs that were counter-representative, so the sampling wasn't very accurate. People criticize the classification scheme, the kind of Cantometric characters, as not fine-grained enough in some instances, and also too fine-grained in other instances. So there was kind of both sides were upset with how the classification scheme was organized, and the kind of the qualities that Lomax was trying to investigate in each song. One of the really big critique, or a very strong critique of Cantometrics, was that there was a confirmation bias and problems with statistical analysis of the music. And so the confirmation bias would be that the people coding the music would be expecting, they would kind of have an idea of where this music was coming from, and then they would code the music accordingly to reflect the certain social conditions in that culture. So it's a confirmation bias. And the fact that the coders were all mostly American and European descent, and their kind of implicit biases or ethnocentrism made its way into their interpretation of the musical characters, of the musical style and quality. And so this kind of, even if it was not intentional, it's very difficult to take human biases out of the equation when you're talking about music of a very unknown culture to the coder, or and also just it isn't generally hard to take ethnocentric biases out of people. And all these critiques of Cantometrics are valid. They're also valid. They're critiques that could be really applied to any project where you have humans making judgments, aesthetic judgments in many cases, about other human output. So it's a complex thing to do. It's not easy, but I have to applaud Lomax's vision in a way attempting to study the music of the entire world under one system. And really that leaves us with my question to you is like, what can be done? I think there are very few areas of scholarship that attempt to understand human output, human activity in relation to culture on a global scale. And I think there have been some ideas about, grand theories or grand projects in the past, but my question is, are projects like Cantometrics doomed in our kind of hyper-individualized, shifting, and relative world? Is there any room for us to understand music, human output, as a human phenomenon rather than like an atomized cultural studies with very little relationship to other people? And so I think that's a good place to stop our lecture today. Is a question to you: is what can be done in the future? Is there some way of understanding and studying the whole world's music, or the whole world's output, traditional musical output, and understanding that under one system? Or is it impossible to do? Is it just too difficult? I think the article you read gives you one idea, that it is possible with more time, more effort, more refinement of the Cantometric style. But I think even outside of Cantometrics, it's a question for you to ask yourselves: is that, can we really understand other cultures, and how we do that, how we understand especially the artistic output of other cultures, and can we put that into a global framework? Or is that impossible to do just because of the complexity of it, or because of the implicit biases we have as human beings growing up in one culture and not in another? So it's a big question for you to answer as you go on in your studies and your lives. But I hope you enjoyed at least a little bit of the glimpse of one way of classifying music, one way of understanding music as a cultural and social human activity, and how it relates to the social structure of different cultures. Like I said, we could have done a very general introduction to music classification, but I thought it'd be more fun to go into one style, Cantometrics, and the kind of really important work that Alan Lomax did. And even though he's passed away, and there are still people working in this style of kind of comparative musicology, and kind of more of an analytical understanding, or a kind of maybe even more scientific understanding of way of classifying music and understanding its relationship to culture. So thanks very much.